So this will be a quick video to just finish up the rest of chapter 25. But I want to talk about large differences between organisms and how they pop up evolutionarily. Because you may look at the incredible diversity of life and say, yes, I understand how antibiotic resistance can develop in MRSA bacteria, but how do we end up with the great diversity of organisms we have today? And the easiest answer is time, right? With 4.5 billion years, or even significantly less than that, that's enough time to have quite a bit of evolution occur. But also, sometimes relatively small amounts of genetic changes can cause relatively large changes in terms of the morphology or physiology of an organism. And this is particularly the case when you talk about genes that are regulatory, meaning they don't code specifically for the pigment in your eye, but they code for the timing and rate of development, for instance, of your arms, legs, and body plan. And changes in the rate or timing of these developmental events that occur across evolutionary time are called heterochromy. And it can have a big impact on the shape of your body with a relatively small amount of change in the genetic material. And one type of heterochromy is called pedomorphosis. And pedomorphosis essentially accelerates the rate of reproductive development so that you become sexually mature more quickly. But when you're sexually mature, you retain some of the features that once were associated with juvenile individuals. And humans and chimpanzees are an example of this. So humans and chimpanzees, you may have heard, share like 98.5% of our DNA, something like that. And yet, there are some clearly very large differences between humans and chimpanzees. Well, this is one of the reasons. So chimpanzees, their adult skull looks very different from our adult skull. But the fetal skull doesn't look that different from our fetal skull. They undergo a big change in the rate, or in the shape, I should say, of the skull, but we don't. And this, could be construed as an example of pedomorphosis, right? We retained that juvenile feature into adulthood, and so essentially we all look like baby chimpanzees. Very cute. This salamander is another example of that. You can see that this particular species retains gills into adulthood and lives underwater and retains a tail, right? These are all things that when you consider tadpoles, right? These are considered juvenile structures in amphibians, but this is an adult of this particular species of salamander. And so the evolution of development, or these genes that govern development, play an important role in the diversification of organisms, probably played an important role during the Cambrian explosion. And so Evo-Devo, or the evolution of development, is a big area of biological research now. One very important group of these developmental genes are called Hox genes, and they provide like locational information for where to put organs. And one example of how you might get a six-legged insect that evolved from a many-legged crustacean ancestor uses one of these Hox genes, in this case UBX genes, which has been identified, and you can turn it off to turn off leg development. And so if you turn this gene off earlier, again, this is one of the Hox genes, you end up with fewer legs from many legs. And these land insects evolved from crustaceans that were found in the ocean. Now, one last thing before we leave chapter 25. I want to mention that evolution is not a goal-oriented process, right? It has to do with whatever works best in that environment at that moment and allows you to leave more offspring. And so it tinkers with whatever you have going on at the moment, and it improves it in terms of how you can deal with the current environment. It modifies existing forms. It's a tinkering process. And that tinkering process actually explains sometimes why things are imperfect, right? Like my back hurts right now. And that's because my back is not a perfectly designed back. My back evolved from the backs of individuals that were on four legs, and now I'm on 2 legs, and it works well enough, right? It allowed my ancestors to survive and reproduce, but it's not designed perfectly for upright walking on the land. So everything evolves from a structure before it that would have popped up. But that structure before it had to have been useful in its own time. So these instances where you have structures that evolved in one context, but then evolution co-opts them for a different function, these are called exaptations. So one example of these are swim bladders. So fish, bony fish, osteichthyes, have these swim bladders that help them with buoyancy, right? To become more or less buoyant, to rise or fall in the water. This structure, anatomically and developmentally, is what became lungs in lungfish, which evolved later on as tetrapods were making that transition to land. Feathers in birds most likely originally evolved to regulate temperature, but then they were able to sort of hold on to air a little bit and help birds to kind of glide a little bit before they could fly, and eventually they were co-opted in an exaptation for flight. And so natural selection occurs only if the initial structure had its own utility and was an advantage for that ancestral organism, but then you find a new use for it that's also advantageous for your generation. The eye is an example of this, right? The eye is very complex, right? And it didn't just pop up there out of nowhere. It evolved from different simpler eyes, many of which you still see in different organisms today, right? But each of these, this initial patch of pigmented cells that could tell light from dark, although couldn't form images, right? This didn't evolve so that one day I could have a pretty cool eye. It evolved because it was useful in that generation at that time. And so being able to tell whether there was light or dark in front of you may have helped you hide, right, from predators when it was light out and you could come out at night, right? Or maybe it helped you move towards the light if you could photosynthesize, or if you ate photosynthetic organisms, whatever it may be. It benefited you in the time. Now, as those pigmented cells begin to form a little bit of a cup, right, just a divot, now all of a sudden you can tell, well, is the light coming from this direction or from that direction? It doesn't give you an image, but it gives you directionality, and you can go more efficiently toward or away from the light. Now, if you get even deeper, and then you have sort of a pinhole in the front, then you can start to form a little bit of an image. And I don't think I have to explain to you why being able to see an image, right, rather than just light or darkness, can give you an advantage, right? It can tell you a little bit more about whether what you're looking at is predator or prey or nothing at all, or whether you're looking at something that's nutritious for you or poisonous for you, right? And then over time, this got better and better and better, right? You got a lens that could better focus and give you a clearer image. And today, this is what we see in our eye. But it evolved over time from structures that were at that time advantageous for the organisms that had them. Another thing we tend to do is we tend to extract an evolutionary progression, a single progression from the fossil record, right? From simple toward complex, from prokaryotes to us, and we are the crowning achievement of evolution. And while I may think that, because we're pretty amazing and we have spectacular brains, and that's something the likes of which the world has never seen, that doesn't mean that we're any more evolved than a bacterium, right? They've been around for billions of years. They are just as successful now as we are. Or insects, right? Ants run the world, man. Ants and bacteria, essentially, run the world. So while we may find complex organisms more interesting, and we've developed more and more complex organisms over time, we haven't developed less and less, or fewer and fewer, I should say, simple organisms. So there is no intrinsic drive toward a particular phenotype, right? So whatever happens to be successful in that generation, that then gets carried on to the next and spreads in a population.